Hello, and welcome to St. Joe's Parish in Ottawa for this morning's reflection. All we tend to remember of the Pharisees is that they were often described as hypocrites. This labeling is a bit one-sided and unfair, and most likely reflects the growing tension felt between the early Christian church and the rabbinic council after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans in 70 CE. During that difficult time, the Jewish ruling authorities ousted the followers of Jesus from the community and accused Jesus of being a heretic and a lawbreaker. These words, which completed the separation of the two groups, resulted in the evangelists, as they were writing the Gospels, to defend Jesus by having him accuse those who were trying to trap him in what he said and did of being hypocrites. In today's Gospel, the evangelist has Jesus quoting a passage from Isaiah, which accuses the Pharisees of valuing their human tradition much more than the Torah and the law of Moses. The Pharisees were basically pious people. What characterized them most was the strict observance of the Torah and the traditions of the elders. In their piety, they did everything possible to do God's will as they perceived it in the commandments. Believing that this would create the right condition for the Messiah to come, they followed all the rules and traditions to the letter, and then some. When the text about ritual washing required everyone to wash their hands when they returned home from the market, they would wash to their elbows. If the law called people to tithe 10% of their goods, they would give 20%. If people were asked to fast once a week, they would fast twice a week. Doing everything in excess ensured that they did not break any taboos or regulations. The word they prized highly was righteousness, which meant being right with God in everything they did. Their passion for order and being righteous would divide their world into two parts, clean and unclean, holy and profane, blessed and condemned. For the Pharisees to be clean, holy, and blessed, it meant not only keeping all the rules, but it was also necessary for them to avoid contact with people who the traditions of the elders said were not blessed by God. Among these traditions was the obligation of frequent washings, not for hygienic or cleanliness' sake, but for removing any ritual impurity caused by contact with things or people they considered spiritually unclean. Sadly, when this idea is supreme, then it is inevitable that God becomes a judge who is only concerned with rewarding and punishing people as they try to integrate their daily life into their worship of God. It is this distorted image which Jesus challenges most often in the Gospels, because emphasizing the external observance can often obscure the true purpose and the meaning of the commandments found in the Torah. For Jesus saw the Torah as a sign of God's closeness to all people. The word that shaped his life and message was compassion. Perceiving the world as good and holy, created by a loving God, gave him the freedom to cross any boundary that separated people from each other or God. Fidelity to the covenant meant hearing God's word at the core of one's being in such a way that their words and actions would reflect the presence, truth, and love of God to all. For Jesus, it was purity of heart that established right relationship with the divine, with oneself, and with one's neighbor. His concern for a person's inner being has him mention a list of ways that would make it difficult for people to reflect the goodness and truth of God. Today, as we reflect on this text, it reminds us of our own constant need for God's mercy and forgiveness in our lives, and keeps us from being critical and judgmental of one another. The heart of Jesus' preaching is not that God will honor our good deeds, but rather that we are invited and challenged to honor and respond to God's unmerited love for us. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard was fond of describing the Sunday encounter with the sacred text as looking into a mirror. For him, the first requirement is that you must not look at the mirror, but must look in the mirror and see yourself in God's Word. The second requirement was to remind yourself that these words are spoken to you. When we hear today's gospel story, we are to look into the mirror of the Word and allow it to reveal the authenticity or not of our goodness. If we welcome the truth, we see God's Word has the power to transform us from within, where all goodness and holiness begins. Believers are then responsible to translate their inner goodness into good deeds and good words that serve the needs of others. Each time the community gathers to encounter Christ and one another in the Eucharist, their commitment to truth and goodness is renewed. As we hear the words, "Go in the peace of Christ to love and serve the Lord and one another," it becomes our responsibility to mirror to the world all that we have experienced. Loved, we are to love. Forgiven, we are to forgive. Fed, we are to feed. Clothed with grace and security, we are to clothe and shelter the needy. To do otherwise is to distort the one whose image we are to reflect. Take care.